pulcējušies esam, lai noklausītos mūsu kolēģis, pasniedzējas, LU docentes atklāto lekciju, docents Aivitas Putniņas atklāto lekciju, kas notiek viņas vēlēšana uz LU asociētā profesāra vietu ietvaros. Un lekcija, kā jūs redzat, saucas, es teikšu nosaukumu latviski, intīmā pilsonība, laulības un citi kopdzīves modeļi mūsdienu Latvijā. Lekcija notiks angliski, tāpēc, ka vēlēšana procesā piedalās arī divi kolēģi antropologi no Tallinas Universitātes un Universitātes, un viņiem arī ir jādod iespēja noklausīties, izvērtēt lekciju un piedalīties diskusijā. Es domāju, ka šis mums visiem būs ļoti interesants pasākums, un es dodu vārdu Aivitai Putniņai.
Pēc tam. Yeah. So, dear students and friends, I'm really happy seeing so many of you here present, and I'm really grateful for this, and especially grateful to Professor Patrick Laviolette at Tallinn and Professor Aivitas Putniņas in Kaunas for agreeing to participate in the process. And my today's topic was chosen some time ago, so it was not related to yesterday's events. And as you know, that government passed its action plan, and one of the policy directions which really captured attention of media was policy direction which was called improvement of the demographic situation, the quality of family life and social provisions. And as a first action in this direction was re-evaluation of the policy activities, whether they facilitate the understanding as a family based on marriage as a value. And what even more captured the attention of media and other people was the increase in marriage rate. The government declaration wanted to make, and which seemed quite unrealistic, as the marriage rate, as we know, in this year is dropping. And what was more, and basically it's well known that governments can increase marriage rates, and some of states in the United States and, for example, Austria have done it. And they have done so introducing a special benefit for those couples who enter marriage. But results of these government initiatives, they have been researched, and they showed that yes, such an instrument can really raise marriage rate, but this marriage rate is raised on account of those couples who were actually ready to marry. So in a way, it's not increasing marriage rates, but it's just speeding up couples entering marriage. And in the long run, it will again stop, because the marriage rate would drop as new partnerships do not form just using cash benefits. And more problematic is decrease in divorce rate, which is even more difficult to stop. And so there have not been measures really known that would stop this decrease in European countries. And in fact, in Europe, this divorce rate is raising quite steadily. So I found some research questions. A few were mine. The first one, what was wrong with marriage if the government decided that it should be strengthened as a value? And we even have a government action plan to reinstall the value of marriage. And there is one even more deeper question to that. Is the value of marriage actually measured in marriage rates? Do marriage rates really reflect the value of marriage? And actually what we see, it's a really consumptionist approach. In a way, more we consume, more we need something, and more dear it is to us. And it also works other way around. Less kind of scarcities, more scarcities, so less valuable it is. I remember having a discussion with school teachers in a program on cultural diversity, and we spoke a lot about taste, and then these teachers said that classical music is really great value, but they do not listen to classical music that often, except of one teacher was teacher of music. And the rest said that they listen to Radio 2, which is kind of pop music channel. But they said, this is why we don't listen to classical music often, but this is a fact which makes classical music valuable, that you don't have it in really big doses. And the same thing happens with a marriage, which is kind of value and it should be reinstalled as a value. The second question, what is marriage and what is family, is a really anthropological question. And as we will see later, does it mean that we mean the same when we talk about marriage and family? And I remember when I published my research on same-sex families, one of my colleagues anonymously commented that the research is not valid because the object of research, same-sex families, are not actually families. So you cannot do research for something which is out of scope of research. And these definitions really matter, and especially in Latvia in 2005 when amendments to the Constitution were passed, defining marriage as a union between man and a woman. And so I will look at these definitions in anthropological literature as well. And third question was posed by a journalist who asked me, has the government such rights to do actually this increase in marriage rate? He asked it several times, and as an anthropologist I said, well, government can do it and governments have done it. It's probably not really reasonable, it's not really kind of effective, and it's quite costly. But this question is much deeper. It's also a question of authority, because the journalist meant that for him marriage was intimate matter, and he felt the governments should not intervene with this intimate subject. And the fourth question is, how do Latvians perceive these changes? And I will rely on two research projects. One was conducted with students, some of them present, on problematics of non-registered partnerships. And partnerships, sorry, this is not, this is Intersectoral Coordination Center who requested this research. And our research was called Factors Influencing Registered and Non-Registered Cohabitation. And both were done last year. And I also participate in state research program ECOSOS, which basically addresses issues of democracy and family policy. And as the state research program expert, I also participate in evaluation of policy in this aspect. So media responded to this government incentive with a caricature saying that facilitating access to marriage would be kind of making it accessible at cash points and supermarkets. So, and it says that this cash desk you can also pay your bills and register marriage. So people reacted kind of was a bit of humor to government proposal. But looking back at anthropology and looking at theoretical approaches to marriage, at the beginning, anthropologists saw marriage as a cross-cultural phenomenon which functioned inside kinship system, and it was different in different societies. And when we think of marriage, it sometimes seems stable enough phenomenon with its cross-cultural historical variations. And anthropologists of 20th century also saw it as marriage as a means to build alliances, for example, exchanging wives, as Levi-Strauss argued. And kinship system in general in those days seemed as a backbone of societies. And what anthropologists learn that marriage is variable across humanity. We know that polygyny is most popular form of marriage and polyandry is less popular form of marriage. And this research advanced a relativistic approach to kinship. So some of the things were relativized. We knew that there are really different forms, but marriage still remained a really stable phenomenon which was seen in each and every culture. Another trend looked at transformations of kinship in relation to economic and legal change in Eurasia, as Goody did it, or in Europe. For example, Goody explored the development of family in Europe, and he saw this development as a prerequisite of development of capitalism in Europe. The same did Ellen Macfarlane, for example. And Goody made several good points in relation to marriage, and he explored the role of Christianity in freeing individuals from traditional forms of social relationships, and we probably know Romeo and Juliet as one of the stories, which is an example of this. And the other discovery was the role of writing. Written testimonies allow transforming issues of inheritance to different channels than actual marriage and kinship. So these put restraints from arranged marriage to other forms of tracks of inheritance. And he also wrote the church was instrumental in weakening hold of local kin groups over their members, and they encouraged individual freedom and control of property. And his argument is still much used in looking at traditional societies, especially where Christian missions take place. Then Edmund Leach, he was quite suspicious of universal definition to marriage, and he famously defined his 10 principles for marriage and said, well, marriage is, whatever would confirm these 10 principles, or maybe just a few of these principles. But what he did, all of them did with relations between man and a woman, relations between parents and children, labor, property, and other socially significant relationships of affinity. So in a way, marriage still was something quite bound. And it was David Schneider in 1984 with his critique of the study of kinship. And he said that the Western view on kinship as a set of social and biological relations between individuals of two sexes and procreation has been imposed on other cultures. So in a way, no marriage, no kinship is such a universal phenomenon. It's actually something that we have taken from our culture and disposed and put it on other cultures. And perpetuation of the self in one's own children, defeat of death and continuity of life, these are images that are dear to Western culture. And we see that cooking and care may express these ties, but this cooking and care also constitutes these ties we take for granted. The same way kissing and copulation may express these ties, but they also constitute them. And Schneider argued that Western culture places value on reproduction and then assumes that other cultures and other people also do the same. So he criticizes doctrines that blood is thicker than water for all human beings. And it seemed as a defeat for kinship studies in anthropology, and kinship, as you know, had been really also a backbone of anthropology. This was what anthropologists mostly done, especially at the beginning of 20th century. And I remember early 90s anthropologists said, kinship studies are done and maybe gender studies come into this place. But it was interesting that kinship studies revived using this new platform. And as Godelier argues that artificial reproductive technologies, homosexual partnerships, they all give a new input to what we understand with marriage and kinship. And they also challenge the view what is motherhood and fatherhood, and that these are biologically determined. There was one other factor. It was globalization of romantic love, intimacy, and change in marriage patterns and divorce rates around the globe. So it was not just a universal phenomenon in Europe, but it did spread globally. And the third factor was that these perspectives also started to encompass gender aspect. And gender became really crucial in understanding families and intimacy. So defining marriage in this new perspective, so just to take Maurice Godelier, he tries to put three accents in this definition. One is, and he speaks of Europe and France in particular. He speaks that marriage is monogamous and nuclear family, and marriage is a component of it. Second component is affinity, which we know that it's cognatic, but with certain patrilinear bias. Can you guess which is a patrilinear bias? For example, in our culture. Surnames, yeah. What we see is that this affinity moves away from extended families, and this cognatic recognition of our affins, it changes. And third is egos, kindred. So we are born into certain network and creates this kinship network. And our network of kin is a bit different than, for example, kin network of our siblings. So this is something which is unique for each individual. So these are three aspects according to Godelier. Second point he makes is concerning marriage and status of children, which is really important link. He refers back to France and beginning of 19th century revolution. And in 1802, France introduced civil unions, which was a new concept we now enjoy. But at that time, civil union was not seen as mandatory. It was optional regulation, but soon it becomes obligatory in eyes of citizens because of one reason. It was the only way to legalize one's own children. And it was not a problem for lower classes because cohabitation was not kind of repudiated as a kind of immoral act, but it rather had consequences in when one came to property. And those people who did not own anything, it didn't really matter for them to get married. And the problem with children was that illegitimate children in France of that days didn't have any rights. And children and their status, therefore, is a really interesting angle to look up in definitions of marriage in general. For example, in 1983 in Latvian, when parliamentarians debated civil code and status of children, they had a dispute what to do with Soviet legacy, because during the Soviet period, paternity played really little role because there was no private property to transfer, and paternity could be invented in cases when the father was absent. So all children in the Soviet Union had fathers' names, but not all children had actual fathers. So Latvian parliamentarians debated the issue, and some of them argued that the law should install different legal attitudes toward children which are born illegitimately, and they actually called them bastards in debate. And of course, it's not viable now because we have Convention of Children's Rights which removes this kind of discrimination. But what is interesting when we look back at Godelier is that it also removes a really strong motivator from marriage. So if children do not have any discrimination according to their birth, it's also not a motivator for parents to marry, to give children privileges. And second point, which is also quite interesting in relation to Godelier, it's also a question of authority. And he writes that in early 19th century France, it was paternal authority over children which also was extended to marriage. So usually fathers should agree on their children marriage. And in fact, this paternal authority was officially abolished in France in 1970. And the Civil Code of France stated parental authority in education, health, care, safety, and morality as well. But it also freed from defining authority as a major discursive strive. So parents were responsible for their children, and authority was not a discussion. But the question the journalist asked, and I mentioned, the state authority is still a question. It's interesting that the way we frame the question, it makes the issue of authority quite hidden. And so the question, its authority, whether the state is to decide upon different aspects of intimate lives of their citizens. For example, who is eligible for marriage, who is eligible to donate egg cells. For example, our Minister of Health announced that there was a risk for women to run out of their egg cells after donation. If they are, and when they are ready to have children, they would have no eggs. I was present at discussions, are Latvian women capable of home births? And some parliamentarians who were physicians argued that women are not. Their health is deteriorating and they're too weak. And it's also a sign of madness if they agree to home births. So Parliament should take responsibility and deny access to home births, because birth at hospital is much safer. Or current ambitions of our government to promote marriage. But what has happened, obviously, has happened why it is a problem. And Godelier clearly says that marriage no longer makes a family, and it's not a moral statement, it's a social fact. Because couples are made before marriage, and couples marry when they decide it would stabilize their union. And he argues that family is made when children come into this partnership. Also, kinship networks shrink. but they still remain important support at times of crisis. But they are still more a matter of choice than obligation. And childhood and children are valorized. They are really essential part of family, but parents have much more roles in the family than just mothering and fathering. And the fourth form, which caused this public outburst concerning government declaration, it's a change of authority towards more negotiable forms, and we see this in Latvia, that even parental authority changes. Some years ago we had discussions on corporal punishment over children, and this is not only punishment, it's also exercising authority over children. It's also a question of domestic violence and Istanbul Declaration. How do we form authority? How do we exercise power in our family? Are we negotiating, or do we have kind of other means and violent means of opposing our authority on others? For example, Estonian family policy, as one of the key instruments, they have education of parents, because they have found out that Estonian parents are not having children because they feel insecure as parents. So they are learning parental skills, and the state is providing this. And this is really a new challenge, because authority is less fixed to certain positions and more negotiable. And for some reasons also threatening to people who have had authority just by position. It's also urbanization and industrialization. Individuals have greater independence, women enter economy and also gain more authority. It's more true of the third world, but these changes happen in Europe as well. And Marxists would add that capitalists also have free-floating labor force. Godelier adds that it gives women more authority if they participate in economy, and they have authority in family as well. Second is romantic love and marriage. McFarland has argued of romantic love and companionship and its link to economic development in England. And the complex of romantic love spreads worldwide. For example, we also witness a change of traditions. For example, we always are bothered by celebration of Valentine's Day. So we've had 8th of March, which never meant what was written officially, that it's International Women's Day, but it usually was a day when all men gave flowers to all women, so it was not personal or intimate in a way. Now it's replaced by Valentine's Day, which has this really romantic love and intimate relationship connection. And it also signifies significant move to understanding of gender relations. And Wadlow and Hirsch, in their introduction to a really wonderful collection of ethnographies, Modern Loves, they question actual success of companionship, which is characterizing marriages. And as ethnographic studies in this book show, tensions arise from one's inability actually to transform this romantic love and courtship into more egalitarian conjugal bonds. So in a way, there is some kind of tension between really romantic promises and real everyday life of a couple, and a lot of people are caught between this tension. And Marxists also had linked love and capitalism. And for example, seeing love as mystification and actually love as concealing exploitation of women in domestic and public spheres. And as well, Bourdieu asks whether love and romantic love is not a form of masculine dominance. And looking at my own relationship my own research on reproductive health, we asked young people whether it's acceptable that people should not live together if they do not love each other. And our respondents, which were people aged between 16 and 20, they all said, well, yes, of course, you don't live together if you do not love each other. And they agreed also that children should stay with their mother. And this all leads to equal distribution of responsibility and also wealth. For example, our civil code states that both parents have equal obligations towards provisioning their children. But, and of course, this parent who is raising the child can request alimonies, which is a share of other partner, which is state minimum plus the sum, which should be proven at court above this minimum. And then this partner raising the kids, having kids in custody, should have to prove that this children costs more than 111 euros per month. But the system largely disregards childcare responsibilities. And again, even this childcare responsibility is seen as a form of affection. Mother is having affection towards her child, and her care for child is expression of this affection, which is not to be transferred into economic benefit. And therefore, it does not come into this economy of parenthood. Returning to companionate marriage, it includes prior romantic relationship. Usually partners before marrying know each other romantically. It's individual choice how partners are found. It's expectations of fidelity. It's nuclear family household usually, and it's also stress of verbal approval of affection over instrumental expression of affect. So people are expected generally in this companionate marriage to say I love you, but not express this through, for example, washing or mending partner's clothes. And Shkolnik, analyzing US case at the end of 19th and 20th century, he describes decline in fertility, high infant mortality, and longer lifespan of people. And he argues that this lifestyle creates a space when couple does not have to care for young people. So this gives space for companionship. So in a way, there is really a large proportion of life in couples' life where people should enjoy companionship. And new images of affect and intimacy come into place, and Hollywood films are really important globally. Also, our Latvian reality shows and soaps are really a lot about marriage and issues around marriage and intimate relationships. And Illos in early 20th century US, she describes this moral panic we sometimes also experience, that popular culture has a really negative impact, and marriage is in crisis now. And marriage in crisis started already at the beginning of 20th century. And what was worrying is that Hollywood offered marriage as a kind of hedonic pleasure. You also have seen romantic films where people meet and it's kind of romance and everything is happy, and then things just move into marriage and everyone is really happy. It usually ends at this point, but this also influenced people, and they really kind of tried to imitate this kind of thing, and it increased divorce rates. Because it never showed how actually there are not so many films of marital life, successful marital life. I mean, it's probably boring films. But what happens in the United States at this time is that people come up with ideas that marriage should be taught, and there are first marriage classes and marriage education. So marriage becomes not only affect, but it's also science, and there are first researches on marriage. So it's scientific evidence plus hard work. So marriage should be sustained. It's not a hedonic pleasure. And it's also changed in relationships from social obligations to so-called pure relationship, as Giddens names it. So desire, love prevails over social constraints, as says Godelier. And but this is another end. As Giddens says, pure relationship dissolves once these relationships do not offer satisfactions anymore. And but researchers should be really careful that establishing link between self-chosen marriage and new forms of marital conduct, that it's really variable across the globe, and even in Latvia. Romantic courtship and premarital sexual freedoms are not always linked. Not all people engage this practice, and more comparative perspectives should be used. And especially it's true even for Latvia and even more for global forms. If we use companionate marriage as a term, it might mean really different things to different people. And in fact, Hirsch and Wardlow in their book show it. And just to demonstrate, this is a quote from my research on masculinity. I really like this. And this is a way how social conventions actually form affections. I will translate, I want to show this in Latvian, but I will translate it for colleagues. My next husband, he seemed such a sissy, and then my eyes opened. My girlfriend said that he has kind of movements as a fighter. I said, no, it can't be. And he was really Greek-Roman fighter. And then I saw his hands, really white hands, that he cannot do anything with technique or really real job. But then he comes to me on a motorcycle and my heart melts. And this is how impressions changes. And then you see how really different aspects are intervened with affect. The affect is not something which comes out of biologically or even individually. It's deeply linked with these social constraints which we believe the individual choices would allow us to avoid. It's also about emotional intimacy and so-called affectionate self in love, which is part of modern self, or also part of culture of individualism. And the problem is that emotional intimacy is not a sign only of reflexive selves, but also a strategy of dependence, for example. And people are obliged to negotiate these idealized versions of marital relations, sometimes in really difficult circumstances. And we know that, for example, domestic violence, this is one of the problems, that couples are usually forced to continue their relationship, sometimes violent relationship, just because they have difficult circumstances to disrupt it. And so class, gender, economic opportunities open to men and women really differ even in one culture. And we should be really careful whether it's free will, as we sometimes assume. One more aspect is that consumption is also becoming part of marriage. We know that households have become sites of consumption rather than production, and couples are really made through consumption, not only through affect. And we can see that, for example, dating increasingly in 20th century moved outside to public spaces. Before, people would call at each other home. Now people go on dating, and dating is sometimes quite expensive, probably, as you know. Because you have to go to places and to find places, and so it's not easy. And building these relationships is also a lot about consumption. It is said that couples should find common interest, they should spend quality time together to stabilize their relationships. So relationships they're really much about consumption. So just to show a small episode from a Russian film, it's unfortunately in Russian, but during Soviet period when consumption was somehow limited, even at those periods, articles gained sometimes in scarcity, they symbolize social relationships and love. So there are two episodes. One is a man with his lover who makes him a present, and the second would be the same man with his wife bringing this present home.
Зачем?
Да я прошу. Отвернись. Не смотри.
So I won't translate, probably it's...
Руки. Посмотри. Нравится?
Очень. Спасибо. Зачем так тратишься?
А я хочу, чтобы ты модный был у меня. Ну все, иди теперь.
Аллочка. Можно пока у тебя повисит, а то... Ну, приду, что скажу?
He asks whether this jacket cannot stay with the lover.
Ты же понимаешь, что там ничего нельзя, здесь все можно.
So, and the second episode.
Куда я пойду?
А где?
Ну, трудно сказать все это.
Ну ничего, мужик. Говори. Это сначала трудно, а потом будет легче. Всем.
Я был вытрезвитель.
Это вам там выдавали?
Ну, я же сказал, ты Евдокимова куртка. Он привез.
Можно?
Конечно.
This was probably an example how commodities mediate affectionate relationships. And basically there are three actors, or four actors. There were these two women, the guy and the jacket, which played an important part in this relationship. And but as both Hirsch and Warlow, they warn us that we should look at this socio-economical and political context in which marriage exists. And this is not the first suggestion. Shepard Hughes said in 92 already of political economy of intimacy, how emotions themselves, their value, their meaning are shaped not only by culture but also by material powers. Or Connell speaking of gender regimes which are composed of labor, power and affection. Or the same for Bourdieu. So there are some economic formations which promote companion marriage. And private and domestic spheres, they are also highly charged political arenas where labor, sex, reproduction, care for young and elderly is conducted. But it doesn't mean that there is no room for tenderness, pleasure, companionship, but it's we need also as anthropologists to focus on inequalities. And the second point is that marrying for love and staying in marriage for love is not the same. Other kin ties are increasingly created with and demand affection. And sometimes emotional and economic claims and situations outside the domestic sphere, they contradict that expressions in the family. And so we should see how this ideology of intimacy lands in particular ethnographic and demographic situations, and how they are linked to production and consumption. And therefore, the last comment, prevention of divorce, is more complex enterprise than just fixing intimacy, because exit out of marriage is not life-threatening anymore. We have individual independence, we have welfare programs, but it also shows inequalities and tensions that are created by understanding marriage, and therefore our even Latvian research of divorce was really informative of complexities of marriage. And we see problem of lone parenthood and poverty in EU as a consequence of transformation of marriages. Just shortly to look at Latvia, because I've talked too much, we see our research hit just the surface. These are probably those at the back desks cannot see, but these are marriage and divorce tendencies our government tries to influence by its declaration. So we see that since 2011, those who sit closer, that marriage rate changes and drops a little bit because it's economic crisis. So crises really have impact on marriage rates. But marriage rate had recently increased. And divorce rate also, you can see this is this place, it suddenly increased. Do you know why? Why did we had higher divorce rate at this time? Can you guess? Oh, it's simply because it was when notaries were allowed to officially form and write divorce papers. So it's not that couples suddenly kind of wanted to have divorce. More often it's simply this divorce rate had already accumulated and had formed this peak. And we also see that looking back at the 20th century, so at the beginning of the 20th century, we see that divorce rate is rising already during 40s. And it's quite steady increase till 80s, and especially economic crisis in 90s also increases separation. But already Soviet government did have plans at this stage to stop this increasing divorce rate. And Gorbachev's plan and campaign against alcohol use and abuse was largely linked to family policies, seeing alcohol abuse as one of the main reasons for divorce. But we see also a really interesting thing, that the marriage rate is dropping since getting independence, and which shows really interesting and allows to ask interesting questions. And so in 40s of 20th century, marriage rate was twice higher, but at that period approximately 20% of children were born out of wedlock. So this number was also comparatively high. And the problem with the graph is that, and probably also with government indicators, is that these dynamics do not show us those marriages have been postponed. So we do not know the number of couples who postpone their marriage and they would marry later. They are kind of ready and prepared. So we've got couples but not marriages yet. And we do not know whether these marriages and statistics, they have formed after long cohabitation period without marriage, or they are really quick, spontaneous decisions. So we really don't know much about, so these graphs do not help us to understand the situation. And in fact, Eurostat and also last demographic report of 2050 says that it's impossible and increasingly impossible to analyze and compare data between EU states. First, because this definition of marriage, definition of cohabitation, it's really different in different EU countries. Some of EU countries have registered partnerships and marriages. Some countries allow same-sex partners and heterosexual couples entering marriage. Some have two kinds of partnerships for both kinds of couples. Some of the countries entitle the same kind of benefits to just cohabiting and unregistered couples. So the trends, actual trends behind the numbers, they are inaccessible by statistical analysis as well. So we are really left wondering whether we should switch to different kind of data and whether we can compare these things at all. And looking at the age at first marriage, which is kind of really stable number, we see that it's also rising since 90s. So in a way, this graph of decreased marriage rates also includes these postponed marriages. So people really tend to conclude marriages later. And what is interesting is that this gap between men and women, it's still quite stable. So this pattern doesn't change. So gender relationships are still quite stable. And since 1990, for men, this age at first marriage has increased for 6.3 years, and for women 6.2 years. And there is certain fluctuation in these numbers as well, but I won't get to it. There is one more interesting graph. It's comparison of women's average age at first marriage and age at first birth since 65. And you can see kind of really good, decent gap prior 1992 when these two lines switches. And now what happens that first, on an average, Latvian women give birth, and then the child, then the marriage is concluded. So marriages are concluded, and it's average, so it's kind of generalized data. And of course, this started to happen already in 80s, because this gap in between, it's not 9 months, it's a little bit less average. So it means that people also in these times got married when they were expecting children. So these tendencies are really gradual. And this tendency to start cohabitation prior to marriage, so it's at least 16 years old. And what is new is that people do not say that this is something special anymore. 16 years ago, people would say, yes, This is special. I remember myself conducting research in maternity homes, and in one of regional maternity wards, I was informed that it was in '97 that before women did not give birth out of wedlock in this maternal ward. If they did, they were kind of ballerinas. And everyone came and looked at them with really great curiosity. Now, quite a lot of women gave birth out of wedlock. And I remember in one maternity ward, there was a doctor who was not married, and she gave birth. And what other doctors did, they sneaked through her papers trying to find who was the husband, because they said that it's essential right for them to know this. So there is certain tension of what we think, how we live, and how we want to live, and how we actually live. Attitude towards marriage, it's not changing that fast, but it's still, there are also small numbers. But the top graph shows cohabitation of partners outside marriage is acceptable. So the dark green shows completely agree. So in 2008, almost quarter of Latvian respondents said yes. But in 2015, 39% of respondents say that cohabitation is permissible. So the raise is quite significant. And the second question was concerning marriage's outdated institution, and there is no change. So marriage is still valuable, and we can say this to our Prime Minister and our parliamentarians, that this is not a thing they should really worry about. And attitude towards marriage, whether people should get married. And we can see that there is certain graduation, and most of men and women would certainly marry after the birth of a child. And other lines are much less clear. So moving into the same household, starting sexual relations is even less popular thing. So it means that marriage starts before, family starts much before marriage. Just entering to the end and mentioning three contexts. Our data shows that Latvia also has a really specific gender context. Gender relations and equality of partners, it's not such an easy question because of division of property. In Latvia, women still tend not to own property, even they contribute to this property. Women usually play as guarantors to their partners who take the loan. And usually loan takers are proprietors of the property and owners of property. But women, they have to pay this guarantee, not owing this property, especially when it is confiscated by bank, but the debt remains behind them. It's also concerning marriage proposal, and it's interesting that in Latvia, even young generation believes that it is a man who should propose the marriage. And this does not change through generations. There are traditional gender roles in domestic and public. And also affectivity itself is gendered wired. Its relationship between couple and children and its expression is gender-based. There is economic context because state benefits to married couples are virtually unused. There are some. Divorce is regulated in case of marriage, but still economically stronger partner wins a divorce. Economic gain is juxtaposed affection, and actually most affectionate partner usually loses out when relationship dissolves. And property is a motivator for marriage, but there's not so many people in Latvia have property. It is not a strong motivator. And so we can hope that with more fluent society we could have more marriages. So in political context, intimate citizenship and state authority really is important in Latvia. all these questions around reproduction are really politically important. And there is a big question whether it's really wish or will to influence the processes, or just claiming political authority on the basis of these processes. So, what's wrong with marriage? That it is not the only building block of family, but it's still valuable. It's like with this classical music, we do not listen to this often, but we still value it. What is marriage and family? That marriage is closely linked to state authority, and people say they do not get married because they do not like the state putting hand on it. Has the government has such rights to increase marriage rates? Certainly yes, but it is expensive and ineffective in the long run. And the question itself shows and disposes certain form of political authority. But these tensions inside the couple appear usually at the dissolution of relationship. And at this point, couples realize that their relationship had never been solely intimate, that it had been gendered, politically, socially, and otherwise compromised. And how do Latvians perceive these changes? There is still a gap between action, what people really do, and value system, what they recognize they do. And there is strong contradictory systems of value. And when we ask questions, what should be, what would you, and real actions, there was really strong divorce between all these three options, and people answered differently. So I conclude at this point, and so we can start discussion. Garrett? Could you join in, Patrick?
So thank you. We will continue, I think, our discussion in English to include Patrick Laviolette from Tallinn University and also Aivitas Putniņas. Anyway, thank you, Aivita, for a very interesting lecture and for the problematization of the issues of marriage and family, and providing us with a very, very in-depth, both theoretical and practical context in which these issues are placed in Latvia. And if I may, I would like to pose the first question, which is that why do you think this undebated value of marriage, which is clearly what the governmental policies is based on, why do you think this undebated perception of marriage as value is so persistent among part of Latvian population and especially politicians? What would be your opinion of?
Yeah, I tried to answer it. And I would probably follow Godelier's argument. It has to do more with claiming authority than stating certain values. And rather the question and research question would be who gains from making such a proposal, and what are benefits of asking these questions. And we clearly show that and if we look at political spheres, that there are persons or political entities who clearly gain authority and establish and position themselves using these questions. And this is not unique to post-socialist space in general, as also Watson had argued. So that's why sometimes people, especially Westerners, wonder why do we have all these debates. For example, in the beginning of 90s, so much debate was going around rights to abortion and other rights related to women, which didn't seem to be kind of really of first and primary importance when we had to fight corruption, build political, economic system. But these questions are still much more important than, for example, family centers and other family support forms.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience?
focused on marriage and cohabitation, like anthropology and demography, sociology. There are also legal aspects. So what is specific role of anthropology if we focused on study of marriage and forms of cohabitation? And is there maybe some such general theory where we are moving with those changing forms of partnerships?
Yeah, I tried to show it. What anthropology seems to head at is really different and diverse forms, that we cannot speak of marriage as some kind of coherent thing. Even in our culture, it would mean really different things to different people. And I think this is a problem also for demographers and statisticians at this point, that it becomes more and more clear that we do not attach the same kind of meaning to these words. And probably this is contribution of anthropology to find out this semantic field, and anthropology is especially good at this. And the next, I think, contribution of anthropology is trying to set these questions of family, marriage, in a broader socio-political context, and to look at economic, gender factors, which are really important context where families and marriages function. And probably this also allows to see different solutions to problems. And finally, it's cross-cultural data. And it's really interesting how this revival of kinship studies and really focus on romantic love and marriage, which is really popular anthropology in recent years, how it focuses on third world countries, and it clearly shows that romantic love is not functioning the same way everywhere.
Any other questions or comments?
I would like to ask, why do you think in Latvia there is no strong NGO actually what is somehow impact this political discussion in the case of marriage and cohabitation?
Well, I think the problem is with posing the problem. And in Latvia, we usually address these issues. We call it demographic problem, which means that it's not actually a demographic problem in terms of demography, but this is really a question of procreation and state control over procreation. And I think the problem is not that there are no NGOs standing behind it, but it's simply these NGOs do not hit the problem from the same kind of angle. And when they try to reformulate the problem, it's not kind of seen really viable. It's really difficult to engage the discussion. If we name this discussion or formulate this discussion, for example, around demographic panics, that we are dying out, what we should do. And it's really difficult to find, and the problem is in formulating the thing. It's in other European countries, people formulate the question, how do we increase quality of families and quality of family life? And then we assume that families are more free to have more children. But if it's demographic panic, we see all actors as kind of population and category of people with certain duties, etc., which is kind of really eugenic perspective on people. And we simply do not have any NGOs who would come from a liberal side, they are simply not equipped to enter such a discussion. But they still are. And it's really difficult to answer these questions with that vocabulary. Yeah.
When we kind of like talk about, just see on the last line there, we kind of use the kind of ethnographic idea of the Latvians. I just wonder in terms of, in terms of the last kind of 10, 15 years and the amount of migration from Latvia back and forward from kind of countries and throughout Europe, do you think that those kind of migrations to countries which have various levels, such as Ireland and the UK, well, apart from Northern Ireland, of course, which has, complete equal marriage, France, Pax, etc., Germany with, various forms of partnerships. Do you think that will make any change in the long term to Latvians' attitudes to these kind of things?
Well, I think it should, but I would not agree that it's kind of really, in these countries, attitudes towards marriage would be kind of the same. Probably it's also a class issue, and kind of at which position Latvians arrive there and what kind of partnerships they make over there. And sometimes we see that, and research shows that usually they prefer people from their own countries to form these partnerships just because they feel much safer in those partnerships. But certainly not even working in migration abroad, but also traveling. It enlarges perspective, and people then are kind of more relaxed and probably also more critical. So the difference is not that Latvians would not be liberal in their action. We are really liberal society in action. It's not just we conceptualize what we do. And there I see this kind of Soviet legacy hanging behind. And it's certain social practice not to name things loudly, because it saves you trouble and you can live on. But we had a research where we found out that migration is facilitating out of wedlock sexual relationships, and thus increase the risk of sexually transmissive diseases that we found. So foreign countries are seen as really kind of dirty countries with a lot of disease. Yeah.
Patrick would like to ask a question. Is he there?
Is he?
Are you there, Patrick?
Yes, sorry, the line seems to have gone quiet there for a second. Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for your lecture. I guess I just had a quick question. I'll try to keep it short because I know the technology is a bit odd. But you were mentioning doing your own research on masculinity in Latvia, which I'm assuming is a much more immersive, participant observational kind of project. And then you mentioned doing this study on perceptions to separation and divorce and marriage and relationships with the assistance of certain students, and looking at an age range of 16 to 20. So I guess just quickly, if you could comment on some of the different findings, some of the different epistemological kind of approaches to each of these two different projects. What kind of similarities or differences do they provide you with in terms of analysis, in terms of conclusions?
Well, just out of clarity, masculinity was a really different kind of project, but it also started with a really applied question. What happens to Latvian men? And because the lifespan of men was at that time around the retirement age, a little bit above. And this gap between average lifespan of men and women was more than 10 years at that time. So I thought it would be really useful to ask the question, what happened to Latvian men? And it was more kind of anthropological approach, to men was observations and seeing how masculinity is formed, and then we did research which was also really policy driven and applied question, why people do not marry, and this we did together with our students. It was also anthropological research, but we mostly used interviews, and we interviewed people who were married and who lived in unregistered partnerships, but we interviewed only those people who divorced, both unregistered or marriage relationships. And it also gave some ethnographic glimpse, because some of the students did comment on situations where these interviews are made. And the last study, where the numbers come from, it was mostly quantitative approach, and the research question was really asked by government agency. But what we tried to do, we did put these meanings and formulations we found in qualitative research to ask quantitative questions. And this helped us to show the gap of how people think about themselves and what they do, which was, I think, quite valuable input of anthropological approach to quantitative sociology. Did I answer that?
That's
Yeah.
excellent. That's perfect. Cheers.
Okay. Any more questions?
So, if there are no questions, no more questions, then we thank Aivita, and thank you all for listening and being here. And
Please, before you leave, fill in those papers that you shared with me. And some of those questions you will not be able to answer because they're related to the whole course, but please answer those questions you can. And then leave them on the then just give them to us after this.
thank you.